talk about the basic supplies you would need to start a venture in oil painting. So I have most of these items laid out here in front of me, and we're going to take a closer look at all of these supplies. So let's start looking at paints. The basic paints, the only paints you actually need, are these here at the top. I have a blue, red, yellow, and then I have white and a burnt umber, titanium white and burnt umber. But with these colors, you can mix absolutely any color you need, except for something that's like neon or fluorescent. Ideally, you should have as close to a primary red, blue, and yellow as you can, but different brands of paint have different colors available and different paint color names. So I have a cobalt blue hue. Ultramarine blue would also be a good bright blue. I have cadmium red hue, which is kind of an orangish red, but it's still very vivid. Alizarin crimson is another red. Naphthol red are reds you might find. And then this poor tube is missing its label, but it's actually cadmium yellow medium hue. And then, as I mentioned, titanium white, burnt umber. Now, just a note on paint colors. Paints are made of the color part of paint comes from pigments. A lot of pigments are natural and a lot of pigments are manufactured. Now, some pigments are dangerous. Cadmium is a dangerous pigment. Lead white, you can still find some places, and lead is a dangerous pigment. Now, if you're shopping on a budget for oil paint, you probably aren't going to run across the dangerous pigments because they're natural pigments and they're more expensive. However, I don't recommend getting the cheapest brand of paint that exists because it will be low in pigmentation and it will cause more frustration than it's worth. That said, you also don't need the most expensive brand of oil paints. A good middle-of-the-road brand will do. So mine here, these are old. They're Utrecht, but Utrecht is now owned by Blick. And so you can see here, Blick. I like the Blick brand of paints. So you can see here that my cadmium paint isn't cadmium red. It's cadmium red hue. So you can see. Cadmium red hue. So cadmium red hue means it's not actually cadmium that's in my paint, it's the color of cadmium, it's the hue. So any paint that says hue is fine and is safe. Burnt umber I like because I don't paint with black paint, and I highly recommend that you avoid black paint. Black really sucks all the light from your painting and can dull your colors. So burnt umber mixed with blue actually make a really, really nice alternative to black. So these 5 colors will get you very, very far. If you want to branch out a little bit, some colors that are difficult to mix are pink, violet, and green. So you might want a pink, violet, and green. So I have here ultramarine violet. I think it's a really nice violet. I have quinacridone rose, which is an extremely intense pink. And I have olive green. Then, if you really like using the burnt umber, these earth tones, there are 3 other earth tones that can be nice to have on hand. That is raw umber, raw sienna, and burnt sienna. You'll also want a palette knife. I have a little plastic one here. I'm not sure what happened to my metal one. Palette knives are wonderful for mixing paint on your palette. Because they're a hard surface, as you mix, you can get all of the paint off of here. You're not wasting any of that paint. Whereas if you're mixing with a paintbrush, the paint is going to get stuck in your bristles and you're going to lose some of that paint. It's more wasteful. So the palette knife is a less wasteful way of mixing paint on your palette. Okay, let's move these aside because I want to talk about the acrylic that I have. Okay, since I am not painting with solvents and I still like to create underpaintings, I have some acrylic paint to use for that. Now, I'm using these specific acrylics because it's what I had on hand. But the color is what's important here. I have basically a red, blue, and a yellow again, because I can mix any color I need from those. Now these are a rather heavy-bodied acrylic. If I was going to purchase acrylic just for underpainting, I would probably purchase a soft body acrylic that's more fluid, so it's not going to get any stiff peaks or anything in my underpainting. So because I have these heavy body acrylics, I have an acrylic medium here, the Liquitex Flow Aid, that washes out and makes these paints a lot more fluid to use in my underpaintings. Now, if you're just painting with acrylic and not using oil, you'll want a wide variety of mediums. So the acrylic mediums would replace our walnut oil, our walnut alkyd medium. With acrylic, I really like matte medium. It's probably the one I use the most. They also make a slow drying medium because unlike oil paint, acrylic dries extremely quickly, and sometimes you want to slow that process down. So there's a slow drying medium for that. And then I like the Flow Aid if I want a wash or my paint to be extremely thin and I don't want to add water because that's going to compromise the integrity of my paint. Now I also have a couple of brushes that I use just for acrylic. Oil paint brushes, once you start painting with oil, they'll have oily residue in them that will never fully come out. So I have two dedicated acrylic paint brushes, and I just put a little bit of tape on the end of them since they look a lot like my other brushes, so that I know that these are my acrylic brushes. Now if you are painting with acrylics, one thing I want to mention is the difference between acrylic fine art paint and acrylic craft paint. So paint that comes in tubes or looks similar to this, you're probably good to go for painting on canvas or creating a painting. However, if you have paint that looks like either of these, here's an apple barrel paint, and this one is Blick, but it's a matte acrylic. They come in these little small 2-ounce bottles with the squeeze top, and you can find various brands of these, including Apple Barrel, Martha Stewart, Deco Art, at Hobby Lobby, Joann's, Walmart. These are not fine art paints. These are craft paints. They are wonderful for painting signs and wood and paper mache. They are not long lasting. They are not archival. They are not intended for fine art use. So I know it can be tempting sometimes because these are like $2 and a tube of fine art acrylic is maybe $5 to $8, but it's not worth it. These are even quicker drying than this, have an extremely matte surface, which again is great for craft work, not great for what we're doing. When painting with oils, an important item you're going to need is primer or gesso, and I use acrylic gesso. That way I can paint either acrylic or oil paint on top of it. So gesso is used to prepare our surface. If you see a white canvas for sale in the art supply store, that white that's on the canvas is gesso. It's already primed because raw canvas is kind of a cream or a tan. So if it's white, it has a primer on it. And oil paint, if you're going to paint with oils, it is necessary that your surface have a primer, have gesso on it, because oil will soak into the canvas or the wood board or the paper, whatever surface you're using, and that oil will slowly eat away at that surface. So we want to protect it, and acrylic gesso is what we use to do that. So I buy a rather thick gesso, and sometimes I like to thin it out or water it down. So I also just have a separate container with a lid that I put mixed gesso and water inside if I want a thin coat. Especially when I'm priming raw canvas, I like my early coats to be thin so that they absorb into the fabric. And we can thin it as long as we don't add too much water, because we do use multiple coats, a minimum of 3 coats of gesso on any surface that you're going to paint. I also use foam brushes to apply my gesso. I like the foam brush because it doesn't have bristles or brush hairs that can fall out and get stuck in your nice primed surface. You'll also want white rags, and I use old torn up t-shirts. The reason you want them to be white is when you're cleaning your brushes, you want to be able to see if you've gotten all of the paint or all of the color out of your brush. And if it's a dark color, you can't tell that. So I just collect my old white t-shirts and cut them up and use those for rags. But you can purchase bags of white rags at most art supply stores, or at a home supply store. You can get those sort of rag-like paper towels that come in a box. But old t-shirts are free. You'll want a palette. Now, I just use disposable palettes. They are like freezer paper or wax paper, and when you're done, you can just rip out your page and throw it away. So this is the palette I have right now. It has white waxy paper in it. I actually prefer the palettes that have gray paper. I love the gray paper because as you're mixing values, you can see how light or dark something is, where against white, everything just looks dark. So the gray palettes are really, really nice, but they're not as easy to come by as the white ones. Since I'm painting without solvent, I have walnut oil that I use to clean my brushes. So this is the M-gram walnut oil. And I have a little old garlic jar that I put the walnut oil in. So you want a little container for your walnut oil, preferably with a lid so you can just seal it up and keep it in your studio. Now, it looks very similar to the walnut oil, but if you read the label, they're actually a little different. This one is my painting medium. It's the walnut alkyd medium. And this painting medium speeds up the drying time of your oil paint. Now, oils take an extremely long time to dry, and especially if we're working for a class or just learning how to paint, we don't want those really, really long drying times. We want to speed it up just a little bit. So alkyd mediums do that. I used to use liquid a lot. Recently, I've been using this one since I'm already using walnut oil, and I've been using a lot of this brand of paint that has walnut oil in it as well. So just for consistency, I've been using the walnut alkyd medium. Don't get these confused, because walnut oil will not speed up the drying time of your paint. It will have the opposite effect. Speaking of the walnut oil for cleaning my brushes, the other thing I have to clean my brushes is the Masters brush cleaner and preserver. And it's a kind of a soap and conditioner to clean your brushes after you have gotten out as much oil paint as you possibly can using your rag, using the walnut oil. Then you can take your brush to the sink, give it a swirl in the compound, and sort of work it into the palm of your hand to get all of the rest of that oily residue out of your brush. And if you don't remember that, it has instructions on how to use it on the back. So let's talk brushes. You don't need very many brushes, but you do want a variety of brushes. So I use the long-handled brushes only because I'm never working extremely small, and I want to be able to get a little bit of distance from my painting. So these are 4 that I probably use most often. And please don't judge me by my frayed bristles. I don't take perfect care of my brushes. So here you can see sort of the variety in the brushes that I have. So my large brush here is a flat. Flats are rectangular on the end. I don't have any brights here, but brights are good too. Brights kind of taper a little bit toward the top, which mine is actually doing, but not because it was made that way, but because I've broken a lot of the brush hairs. This is a bristle brush, so it's a little stiffer than my others, which are synthetic sable. So oil painting brushes are always bristle or sable, or a synthetic bristle, synthetic sable. Then my synthetic sable brushes over here, I have a small flat, I have a large round, and I have a very small round. So this gives me a variety of sizes and shapes to work with. Now, brushes always have numbers on them that relate to their size, but the sizing isn't always consistent between brands. So within one brand of brushes, you can look at that number for size reference. But for example, here, these brushes are different brands. This one is a 10, and this is an 8 and a 20. And these are both smaller than my 10. So it's not consistent between the 2 brands. For people who are just starting out with painting, I really recommend painting on paper. It's the cheapest, lowest risk support to use. So I have some paper here. This is Strathmore's oil painting paper, 18 by 24. This paper says it doesn't need to be primed, that it's ready to go. But what I found when painting on it sort of raw is I don't like the way the paint and my brush moves across the surface. I still enjoy gessoing and priming this surface for painting. Now, this isn't the only type of paper you can use for painting. Watercolor paper can be gessoed. They make paper called acrylic paper you can coat with gesso. Bristol vellum, even poster board to some extent. If it's not the super shiny glossy poster board, if it's matte, you can give it 3 coats of gesso and paint on that. Because I like painting on paper, I need to have a board to secure my paper to. So I have a lot of drawing boards. So I use the back side, so the side without the clips, of an old drawing board. I'll lay my paper here, tape completely around the perimeter of my paper, so there's an entire tape frame. Give it a few coats of gesso, letting them dry in between, and then I just keep it on here as I paint. When the painting's all done, I use a hair dryer, give a little bit of heat to the tape so the tape pulls off, and the paper usually removes pretty cleanly. If you don't have a drawing board, I wouldn't buy a drawing board just for this because you don't really need to pay the extra money for it to have the clips and the handle. You can just buy a piece of masonite or hardboard that is, roughly 20 by 26, and you can use that instead. It's cheaper than a drawing board. So the tape that I use when I adhere my paper to my board is either the painter's tape that's specifically low stick, or drafting tape. So I have some drafting tape here that's made for paper because regular masking tape is going to be a little too sticky, and we don't want to risk tearing our paper or tearing our painting when we remove it from our board. So the other 2 surfaces that we think of as typical painting surfaces are canvas and panel. So I'm going to show you the panel first. So here I have this is 18 by 24 panel. And I like the panels that are cradled, that have an edge to them, that aren't just a thin board. It helps prevent warping, and it allows us to put a wire across the back so we can hang this when it's completed, and we can have a finished work that doesn't necessarily need to be framed. Now, this one is an unprimed raw panel. You can tell it looks like wood. You can buy them that are already primed. I find that they charge a lot extra to prime it for you, and it's just so easy to prime it yourself that you might as well save a little money, buy the raw one, give it a few coats of gesso. You also have the option when you do that to gesso the whole thing, the front and the sides, so you can wrap your painting along the side or have white edges. Or I like to sometimes just tape my edges before I gesso, keep the tape on there all through the painting process, and remove it at the end, so I have almost like a little wood frame. It's clean and wood still on the edges when I hang it, and it looks nice unframed. And the last thing is stretched canvas. This is when I stretched myself. It does save you a little bit of money, but canvases aren't too expensive. I recommend canvases that are gallery wrapped, meaning there's no staples along the edge. If you have a canvas that has staples on the edge, you really need to frame it to display it because that doesn't look very nice. But if it has a nice white edge, since I stretched this with myself, the staples are on the back. Some of the really nice gallery wrapped ones have the staples completely hidden. But again, I have this little bit of a ledge. I can put a wire on the back here, and I can hang it. I can wrap my painting along the side, or leave it a clean white edge, and it doesn't really need to have a frame. So that concludes my overview of painting materials and painting surfaces. I hope you found that helpful. There's so many possibilities with the materials that you can use for oil and acrylic painting, and it can seem a little overwhelming. So hopefully this overview provided the information that you need to help you as you purchase supplies for the first time and figure out what materials and what painting methods work best for you.